Thank you for joining us tonight. We are currently playing a pre-event slideshow. The first slide shows the live logo in gold on a white background with the text, "Live from NYPL and the Dorothy and Louis B. Coleman Center for Scholars and Writers present A Drop of Treason, Jonathan Stevenson with Gene Strauss, May 26, 2021, 7 p.m. Eastern Time." This slide contains an image of the featured book. The cover shows a black and white cutout portrait of a young Philip Agee wearing glasses and a suit. The background is red with the title in large black letters, A Drop of Treason, Philip Agee and His Exposure of the CIA, by Jonathan Stevenson. A Drop of Treason is available for purchase online from the library shop, on.nypl.org/shop-live. Proceeds benefit the New York Public Library. Reserve a copy for free with a New York Public Library card. Visit tonight's event page to find this title in a variety of formats, nypl.org/live. The last slide shows recommended reading. Jonathan Stevenson and NYPL suggest these titles for further reading: Inside the Company, CIA Diary by Philip Agee, The Interrogator, An Education by Glenn Carl, The Rise and Fall of the American Left by John Patrick Diggins, Morgan, American Financier by Gene Strauss. Check out the full list and other titles by tonight's speakers by visiting the event page, nypl.org/live. Thank you for joining us tonight. We are currently playing.
Hello and welcome to the New York Public Library. Tonight we present another in our series of virtual conversations from the Coleman Center, a collaboration with Live from NYPL. Coleman Center fellow Jonathan Stevenson will discuss his new book, A Drop of Poison, Philip Agee and His Exposure of the CIA. He is joined by the renowned biographer Gene Strauss. My name is Salvatore Scabona. I'm Sue Ann and John Weinberg, director of the Coleman Center for Scholars and Writers at the library. As you may know, the Coleman Center selects 15 fellows a year for a 9-month term. Fellows receive an office in the center, intensive access to our collections, and a living stipend so they can focus exclusively on their work during their fellowships. The fellows are some of the best and most promising academics, independent scholars, poets, playwrights, journalists, dramatists, artists, and fiction writers at work today. They come to the library to use the unparalleled collections housed here to write the books of tomorrow. The program was founded in 1999. To date, it has supported the work of more than 300 fellows. Writers and scholars from any country are welcome to apply, and the next application period will begin next month. Upcoming talks from Live include Derek Del Gaudio in conversation with Neil Gaiman, Akil Reed in conversation with Jeffrey Rosen, Akweke Amezi in conversation with Coleman Center fellow Saidiya Hartman, and Salman Rushdie in conversation with Coleman Center fellow Thea Obrecht. That's all within the next few weeks. If you'd like to register for these or any of the other fantastic events at Live from NYPL, go to nypl.org/live. You can also keep up to date with all of our events and everything else the library has to offer by signing up for our newsletter. To do that, go to nypl.org/connect. All these programs are made possible through the generosity of patrons like you, so please consider supporting the library however you can. A special note to those of you who have been holding back on your own research and your use of the research libraries within the NYPL system. As of May 10th, the libraries are open again in person for research, but by appointment. So any of you wishing to work in the collections, you can do that by booking an appointment and going there. And you can do that by going to nypl.org/research, nypl.org/research. We'll put a link to that in the chat, and you can click the button to reserve an opening to do research. If you have an NYPL library card or live in New York State and want to apply for one now, you can borrow A Drop of Poison. Or if you're able, you can buy the book from the library shop. Proceeds, of course, go to benefit the library. You can find links to get the book in the chat and on the event page found at nypl.org/live. Real-time captions are available for tonight's program. You can click on the closed caption button or use the stream text link shared in the reminder email and chat. Before I invite our guests to the screen, there are a few housekeeping items to go over. This event is being recorded. Even though the video and chat are on an nypl.org page, they are hosted by YouTube. If you choose to participate in the chat, you might share data about yourself, which the library does not control. For more details, you can visit our FAQ page, along with Google's privacy policy and the library's privacy policy, all available on the event page. Our guests will open the discussion with each other for 30 or 40 minutes. After that, we'll open the floor for your questions. If you have questions for Jonathan Stephenson, you can send them at any time using the chat, Google form, or by emailing publicprograms@nypl.org. We will get to as many as we can toward the end of the program. Jonathan's interlocutor tonight is the great Gene Strauss, a friend of many of us. Gene is the author of Morgan, American Financier, and Alice James, a biography, which won the Bancroft Prize in American History. She was the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship and a MacArthur Genius Award, and is a past president of the Society of American Historians. Gene Strauss served as director of the Cullman Center from 2003 to 2017. Right now, she's putting finishing touches on a book about 12 portraits by John Singer Sargent of the family of Asher Wertheimer, a prominent London art dealer. She speaks tonight with Jonathan Stephenson. Stephenson is Senior Fellow for U.S. Defense and Managing Editor of Survival at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. He was Professor of Strategic Studies at the U.S. Naval War College and has served as Director for Political Military Affairs, Middle East and North Africa on the National Security Council. He's the author of several books, including Thinking Beyond the Unthinkable, Harnessing Doom from the Cold War to the Age of Terror, and We Wrecked the Place, Contemplating an End to the Northern Irish Troubles. He was a Cullman Center Fellow in 2016 to 2017. A Drop of Treason is a thoroughly absorbing account, this is what it looks like, of a man who seemed perfectly suited temperamentally and politically to fit into the CIA of the 1960s. Philip Agee's subsequent betrayal of the agency at a moment in the mid-1970s when skepticism of federal institutions had reached a high pitch had devastating consequences for the agency, its officers and agents, and for Agee himself. He would live for decades in exile in Cuba, France, the UK, Germany, and Spain. If you're a student of recent American history and foreign policy, this book is for you, for sure. But it's also for you if you've just ever wanted to know whether Heraclitus was right when he said that character was fate. The question that propels this fascinating book is, why did this consummate square, the child of a Florida businessman, product of a Jesuit high school in Notre Dame, the married father of two, a patriot with excellent personnel reviews in most of his years at the agency, suddenly make himself a saboteur? Was Agee, the dissident at 40, only a disillusioned version of the person who signed up for the CIA in his 20s, as he might have wanted others to believe? Or did his character somehow break in a more radical way? This book examines that problem and much else. We're proud to welcome back to this space Gene Strauss and Jonathan Stephenson.
Thank you, Salvatore. Thank you, Jonathan, for writing this completely fascinating book, which is not only about Philip Agee, but it's also an astute history of US politics and the intelligence community from the 1950s to the 2020s. We will be talking obviously in depth about Agee and his actions, but I'm going to take a minute first to skip ahead and read a couple of sentences from the end of Jonathan's account. Wait, I have to get my screen working here. The fury against Agee, this is quoting Jonathan Stephenson, the fury against Agee has lingered in intelligence historiography as well as in the CIA itself, leaving him the caricature of a disaffected traitor or, at best, a demonized symbol. Perhaps now he appears a more substantial and full-blooded character than that. Well, we can take the word perhaps out of that last sentence, because anyone reading this book will indeed find a substantial and full-blooded, though inevitably still mysterious character. So since A Drop of Treason, I'm afraid I have to point out that Salvatore a couple of times called it a drop of poison, which is kind of appropriate. Hope I haven't embarrassed you, Salvatore. Anyway, since it covers a lot of ground, let's start, Jonathan, with your title. Would you read and discuss the quote and then give us a brief account of who Philip Agee was and what he did?
Sure. Thanks, Jean. Thanks for deleting the word perhaps, at least provisionally. The title of the book is, I think, ultimately kind of ironic and a little bit coy. The phrase drop of treason comes from a line in Rebecca West's classic 1947 book, The Meaning of Treason. And that line is part of the epigraph of the book. And in full, the line reads, "All men should have a drop of treason in their veins, if nations are not to go soft like so many sleepy pears." Now, she was writing about a range of Second World War traitors, mostly British. And I think she meant to suggest that one's doubting the conduct of a decent nation, what she called a drop of treason, kept the nation honest by providing a check on its own very betrayal of its basic principles. But acting on such doubts to actually subvert the state is a much more serious matter. And Agee certainly did act on his doubts. So I'd have to say that his veins carried more than just a drop of treason, as I acknowledged in the last chapter. At the same time, Agee and his defenders, I don't think would characterize him as abjectly treasonous, and might settle for a drop of treason as an accurate measure. So, intelligent minds can differ. I also think they might argue that Agee and his ilk have at least marginally constrained some activities that push the envelope of the CIA's mission, such as, for example, engineering coups. So what exactly did he do? I'll give you a sort of a compressed version of that. He spent a dozen years as a CIA case officer in the Operations Directorate, which might now be called the Clandestine Service, with field assignments in Ecuador, Uruguay, and Mexico City. He became disaffected, and for reasons that we'll discuss, left the agency, and in 1975 published Inside the Company CIA Diary, which is a memoir that he did not submit to the CIA for vetting, naming hundreds of case officers, recruited agents, and CIA front organizations. He was the first ex-CIA officer to go that far, and remains notorious for it. Outing case officers and agents is one of the major sins that an intelligence officer can commit. So publishing that book in 1975 was his primal act of dissidence, but he maintained that disposition pretty much for the rest of his life. And just to sort of put a bookend on that very brief account, he died in Havana, Cuba in 2008 due to complications from perforated ulcers.
Thank you. Good. We will go into more detail as we go along. What drew you to this story?
Well, when I was in college at the University of Chicago, as it happens, Philip Agee's memoir, Inside the Company, was both a political and a kind of a literary cause célèbre. This would have been in my sophomore year, freshman or sophomore year, 75, 76. I was fascinated with his story and devoured the book. In the United States post-Watergate moment, right after the ignominious exit from Saigon, as the Church Committee unearthed the CIA's family jewels, assassination plots and the like. The motivations of his exposure of the CIA's operations seemed to me perhaps not one-dimensionally villainous, but rather complex and interesting, even if perhaps wrong. Perusing the appendix of names of all those blown agents, though, I quickly concluded that he'd probably gone too far and wondered whether he'd even survive. Then I forgot about him for, 30 years, if about. And, I still thought quite a bit about the CIA. So in around Christmas 2008, I saw Rick Perlstein's sort of flippantly pithy Lives They Lived obituary for Agee in the New York Times. Philip Agee was never part of any solution, wrote Perlstein, just another facet of the shadow world's ever proliferating strangeness. And I wondered if that was all there was to it, and decided that trying to answer that question would make for an engaging and engrossing book project. I also suspected that unpacking his story might be constructively relevant to US national security. When I first got the idea of the book, his papers were not yet held by NYU, the Tammet Library at NYU, but in the next couple of years, his wife did donate them to the library, which made for, I think, added impetus for me to get this book project unleashed and pursue it after I returned to New York, having served at the NSC. So that would have been around 2013, 14.
Cool. Daniel Ellsberg is, of course, back in the news again, and we've recently seen the actions taken by Edward Snowden and the person who revealed the information that led to Trump's first impeachment. Would you read the paragraph that begins on page 8 and talk about how Agee differs from other whistleblowers, please?
Sure. Let's see. Paragraph reads, Agee raised the alarm, not about a particular practice or policy, but rather about the CIA's, to him, dubious role as an undemocratic enforcer of a democratic nation's interests. He is the only former case officer to systematically expose the identities of intelligence officers and assets to the public, damaging their careers, and theoretically jeopardizing their lives. But he is more complicated than a mere villain. He is a figure of profound ambivalence and considerable subtlety, and a more sympathetic character than the likes of the mercenary, soulless Aldrich Ames, though that is an admittedly low bar. Since November 2016, Agee has become a more resonant and ominous figure. American politics and government have arguably reached their lowest point, lower than the escalating Vietnam years of a Johnson administration that at least spawned 60s idealism, lower than the apocryphal malaise of the Jimmy Carter years, even lower than the post 9/11 paranoia, grandiosity, and ineptitude of George W. Bush's presidency. The election of a true American abomination, especially one intent on gutting the legacy of a largely admirable predecessor, presents many Americans with a country of which it might be hard to be proud. And it makes salient the question of what national and international circumstances might prompt a person, particularly one whose very profession is applied patriotism, to turn against his or her government. The one epoch in the past 75 years, almost as bleak as the tenure of Donald Trump, was the sordidly deflating post-Watergate world, when Agee decided to expose CIA officers and agents. It was a veritable golden age of intelligence officer disaffection, yielding Snap, Stockwell, and others.
Thank you. What were the pivotal moments that led Agee to turn against the agency?
Actually, can I add a gloss to that, Jean? Can I add a gloss to that paragraph?
Sure.
That might be useful. I think the key points here are that Agee's turn was ideological rather than reformative, and that he went farther than anyone labeled a mere whistleblower, or commonly labeled a mere whistleblower, had before, or I think since. Indiscriminately divulging the names of intelligence officers, recruited assets, and organizational fronts was more in the realm of moles. People like Aldrich Ames or Robert Hansen than what we customarily understand as whistleblowers. And even they would be feeding those names to other intelligence officers rather than the public. Yet he was not a mole. He made his disclosures openly and publicly with full attribution and didn't parcel them out piecemeal to a foreign intelligence agency in order to maximize his financial reward. And while he might have intended his modality of betrayal, as it were, merely to make himself look like an ideological true believer, I tend to read it more as an indicator of the basic genuineness of his convictions. Psychologically, I might add, his very openness about what he was doing might have enabled him to claim that he wasn't really committing treason, at least in his own mind. I could talk a little about Ellsberg if you want, about what he's doing now.
Let's maybe come back to that later, because there's so much to say about Agee. I don't want us to use up our time too much on somebody else. Thanks.
Okay.
What were the pivotal moments that led Agee to turn against the agency and actually against the whole American project?
Well, I think, and I think this is sort of a fairly consistent talking point of the book. There's no single that led inexorably to Agee's turn. Instead, there was a series of professional disenchantments, particularly his facilitating and overhearing the brutal torture of a communist in Uruguay in 1965, that at first just gnawed at him. And ultimately, these kinds of things combined with circumstantial factors, the disintegration of his marriage, child custody battles, romances with idealistic left-wing women, to name a few factors, to intensify his disaffection, which may have been sealed by the Mexican security forces' massacre of student protesters in 1968 when he was stationed in Mexico City. And shortly thereafter, he did in fact resign. The fact that there was no road to Damascus conversion for Agee may feel unsatisfying. But I suspect that this is the case for most professional patriots who turn. It isn't just that they get worn down by the daily grind of spying or incrementally more skeptical about its morality or its value over time, though that certainly happens, and I think it happened with Agee. But treason is a serious decision, and probably more is required. And by the same token, it's highly contingent on particular and often fastidious circumstances. You could make a credible argument that had Agee made it as a businessman after he left the agency in Mexico, or been able to sell a merely critical but essentially vanilla history of the CIA, as he first tried to do, he mightn't have made the vault to tell all author who violated his secrecy oath like nobody's business. Still, I would argue that his subsequent conduct, he kept doubling down on that initial decision, authenticated that decision sprung from a kernel of real conviction. Can I talk a little bit about some communications I've had from a psychiatrist who's doing a history of the CIA?
Sure.
The CIA's psychiatric operations. He sent me a note fairly recently, long after the manuscript was completed and in publication. Very thoughtful and interesting note. So he's composing a scholarly history of the CIA's psychological and psychiatric support programs during the Cold War. And for this, he interviewed several of the senior agency psychologists, pretty sure most of them are deceased, if not all of them, who were involved in Agee's case, including the one who initially evaluated him in 1959, before he was even in the field. And while he admitted he did not see Agee's turn coming, he might regard my assessment of Agee's overall earnestness a little naive. In his retrospective view, from the get-go, Agee was a rather self-regarding, all or nothing type, which he thought Catholic upbringing often produced, who would seek spectacle and glory once the things he initially threw himself into, the CIA, his marriage, became unfulfilling. To my mind, though, that view was might have been influenced by the internal bureaucratic need for damage control, That is to find a silver lining in AG's case that would allow the agency to vet case officers more soundly in the future. In any case, I think that assessment, at least to a degree, begs the question of just why working for the CIA became unfulfilling to AG in the first place, and leaves my explanation viable, if a little bit messy.
The last is you speaking or the psychiatrist speaking? My explanation.
That's me speaking.
Okay.
My explanation, my explanation.
Yeah. Okay. Good, thank you. Can you, I just want to read a quote from, which is appropriate to this, from T.J. Stiles, who's a biographer of a number of historical figures, that I think is quite relevant to this. He says, it's finding the contradiction in the record, emphasizing the way people believe two things at the same time, the way that people do things for reasons they don't understand themselves, the way in which multiple things about a person are often completely in contrast with each other, but are true at the same time, which I think is—
Yeah, it's like a sort of internal cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, but it's probably there in a lot of us.
Yeah, I mean, I think that points, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Well, I mean, I think that Stiles' point about the contradictory aspects of complex personalities and motivations is very perceptive.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly AG is an example of it. I'm not sure, for example, that AG even admitted to himself that he was treasonous or thought of himself as such. I mean, you can sort of take your pick between whether he's just being disingenuous or whether he genuinely believes that. His interior monologue might have been something along these lines. Capitalism has corroded the United States' original democratic ideals, and the CIA is its enforcer. I joined the CIA on the assumption that they were intact, but discovered that was not so. Having helped execute a corrupt national agenda, it is my duty to undermine it. That may have been, in a very summary and simple oversimplified way. That might have been what he was saying to himself, and which elevated his mission above the parameters of betrayal or loyalty. So, through the power of rationalization, the transgression of treason becomes fidelity to a lost national ideal.
Yeah.
That may well have been operating.
Yeah.
And as to the mechanics of his turn, as I mentioned earlier, he didn't have a single critical epiphany.
Yeah.
His shift resulted from a concatenation of contingent occurrences. Had he not heard Oscar Bonauti being tortured in the Montevideo police station, or been on the job during the Tlatelolco massacre, if I'm pronouncing it right, would he have named names in a book? Had he not met Angela Camargo Seixas, maybe?
Seixas.
Would he have sustained Seixas? Would he have sustained his dissident disposition? It's impossible to say, but it's clear that those events collectively strengthened his conviction.
Didn't a guy he overheard being tortured, wasn't that someone he had betrayed? He had told the agency about, so it wasn't just the horror of hearing that, it was that he was responsible.
He fed the police the name.
Yeah. So that ratchets up.
So it was a sort of a double whammy.
Yeah.
It wasn't just the agency and the United States were supporting that government.
Right.
It's that he personally, as a case officer, had facilitated the fingering and interrogation of this guy.
Yeah.
And it went on for quite a while. They tried to cover it up by playing sports on the radio.
Never works. Can we dial back? Pull the camera back a little bit and have you sketch in the political and cultural contexts for his actions? Watergate, the church committees, Castro on the one hand, and then for cultural, the romance of spies, James Bond, Le Carré, Graham Greene.
Sure. And it's all, it all, I think, is real context for his behavior. When he was beginning his CIA career, and during high school and college, the political and cultural ambiance wasn't really conducive to disloyalty in the 1950s. Soviet Union was taken to be implacably evil and dangerous, and the Cold War unquestionably justified, even in extreme forms. You know, the threatening of nuclear annihilation by way of massive retaliation, John Foster Dulles' hobby horse. The Cuban Missile Crisis would have reinforced the agency's assessment that Castro was an extraordinarily dangerous Soviet accomplice, planted in the middle of the United States' most essential sphere of influence and only 90 miles from US territory. Later, matters arose that called the American execution of its strategy, usually summarized as containment, into question. Nuclear deterrence became more stable. So perhaps such outre nuclear threats weren't necessary, and the Soviet Union was more controllable than it had initially appeared. The Vietnam War, supposedly an incident of containment, increasingly appeared gratuitously brutal, as well as operationally and politically futile from a US standpoint. Détente, as I said, proved feasible. Contrary to American fears, Cuba did not appear able to comprehensively infiltrate Latin America. Of course, you could argue that that's in part because of US sponsored resistance and CIA activities. Catholic liberation theology had become a powerful counterpoint to the Catholic Church's complicity with oppressive governments supported by the CIA. I think that's probably at least a latent factor in Agee's motivations. I think all of these factors, combined with things like the torture incident in Montevideo and the massacre in Mexico City, made Agee more inclined to be critical of CIA machinations, to search his soul, and ultimately to leave the agency. They'd have made him feel less like James Bond, if that's what he felt like in the beginning, and he probably did feel a little bit like that, and more like a wayward spy from a Graham Greene or a Le Carre novel, at a time when their grim espionage realism was overtaking and even displacing Ian Fleming's romantic fancifulness. I certainly see, the late Philip Agee is a lot closer to Alec Leamas than James Bond. And once Agee left, the confluence of phenomena that further tainted American institutions would have bolstered, I think, his tilt towards radical dissent. Ellsberg's leak of the Pentagon Papers revealed the bloody folly of Vietnam and the cynicism of the US national security establishment. That was 71. The long-running Watergate scandal impugned the Nixon administration, and by extension, perhaps the entire US government at some level, writ large, 72 to 74. And with respect to the CIA itself, the most acute episode was the Church Committee hearings, 1975, which brought to light a range of nefarious and excessive CIA activities. At the same time, radicalism in the United States had become exhausted, or at least substantially depleted, or tamed in the 1970s, and Agee would find a less depleted and more supportive culture of political activism in Europe, as well as a loose, and I would emphasize loose, transatlantic network of left-leaning activists who included Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Jean-Paul Sartre, Ramsey Clark, former Attorney General, and improbably Bobby Fischer's mother, Regina Winder Fischer, who demonstrated, on behalf of Agee in front of Parliament, I think, or maybe in Trafalgar Square. But there are a number of others, Jane Fonda, but this was part of, it wasn't only he that they gravitated towards. It was a number of other dissident voices, and he was certainly one.
Yeah.
And he certainly caused a ruckus in a number of places, in particular the UK.
Absolutely, more than a ruckus. It's putting it mildly.
More than a ruckus. It was a cause célèbre, and he ended up getting deported.
What is the Giddy line?
The Giddy line, yeah. Well, it originates from a poem by Robert Browning, Bishop Blougram's Apology, in which Browning notes the inherent and vertiginous tension in the personality of many a transgressor. So let me just sort of condense what he says, quoting him. The honest thief, the tender murderer, the superstitious atheist, he says, in equilibrium, keep the giddy line midway. Giddy line between these two contradictory traits, which goes back to Stiles' quote. Graham Greene ascribed this quality to the notorious British mole and defector Kim Philby, for whom he harbored some sympathy. And it certainly affected many of Greene's, embattled fictional characters. And I think it affected Agee too. In the book, I suggested he walked the giddy line between duty and transgression as his CIA career continued, particularly in Mexico City, eventually choosing transgression, for lack of a better term, but not perhaps without ambivalence, at least initially. It took him a long time to, publish a book, between leaving the CIA and deciding to publish, a fairly long time, deciding to publish a tell-all book. In this vein, it's worth noting, in looking at the overall biographical picture of Agee, that he stayed firmly in the West. Unlike Philby, he did not defect. Now, there are a number of reasons that this could be. One is Agee was increasingly not in jeopardy of being in prison, whereas Philby would have gone to jail for the rest of his life, most likely. But I would add, I think that it also reflects a certain, ambivalence about turning completely against the West, and a comfort he felt in still being there. He stayed in the very place that in the middle of the very geopolitical complex that he criticized. And I would add that his moving to Cuba at the end of his life can be read as both an affirmation of the genuineness of his defiance, and on some level, an indication that he missed the country that he had defied. He never stopped. I mean, it's perhaps of some significance that he never stopped trying to get his U.S. passport restored. And he kept reapplying and kept being denied. So I think that, the giddy line also dovetails with the notion that treason, again, is highly contingent, insofar as in part on the susceptibility of the particular subject to various influences. So I suppose Browning and Greene would say everybody walks the giddy line of some sort, but in some cases it's a lot harder to balance than others.
Yeah, good.
Now you asked, you have another question about the field of counterintelligence.
I did, yes. The term MICE, M-I-C-E, as an acronym within the counterintelligence community. What did that mean?
It's counterintelligence experts use that acronym MICE to reference the four main motivations of a traitor: money, ideology, compromise, although it's sometimes called coercion, same thing, and ego, sometimes substituted for that as excitement. So that's a little different. Ego as opposed to thrill seeking, but it's the two are of a piece. And any or all of these, I think, can arise in a given set of circumstances and knock someone off kilter. And I think it's a useful and reasonably accurate device for characterizing the motivations, but it does tend to crowd out the possibility of a legitimate motive. It seems to place ideology on a par with venality, weakness, and self-regard. And I think Agee would argue that genuine ideological conversion is a reasonably noble basis for a turn.
Yeah. Well, a lot of people would agree with that. We're running low on time and we have a lot of questions to get to. So I have sort of a big question at the end. Let's see if we can give the rest of our time to that. It's about the post-World War II doctrines of US infallibility and exceptionalism and of Americans doing God's work all around the world, which were monumentally challenged in the 60s and 70s by Agee, by the US government's own actions, by the anti-war movement and lots of others. The undermining of confidence and authority from that era was profound and has had long-term consequences. And Reagan in the 80s, as we know, wanted to restore American vigor in the wake of Vietnam. And now, 2021, a large percentage of the US population apparently wants to go back to the fictional paradise of the 1950s to make America great again. And I wonder what connections you see or draw between the AG era and the profound crisis that this toxically divided country finds itself in today.
I think what you said is all correct. You know, to a conservative like Reagan, the 60s were a smear on American history, and he wished to regard them as an aberration.
Yeah.
And as you say, he wanted to draw a line under Vietnam and restore America's sense of its own exceptional nature. And, you know, the fact that it was a shining city on a hill, or was that George W. Bush? No, that was Reagan. You know, I think that this was manifested, first of all, in his sort of nostalgic conservatism. But also, I think more particularly in the aggressive foreign policy of rollback, which sought to be, you know, much more frontally depart from détente and challenge the Soviets. And sometimes is given credit for winning the Cold War. The real story being much more complicated than that, but that's another conversation. In any case, the policy of rollback helped rejuvenate the CIA after it had been sort of on the ropes during the Carter years as a result of, you know, post-Church Committee reforms and you know, what is viewed as Carter's fecklessness, again, perhaps a bit unfair, but another conversation. But I think to bring this down to AG, insofar as the CIA targeted Latin America under Reagan, it also revived AG, because that was his wheelhouse. And in a parallel way to Reaganite policies, Trump's man to make America great again, which conjures sort of delusional nostalgia for the pre-Vietnam and pre-Civil Rights Act 1950s, has reinvigorated the American left. The twist is that Trump didn't instrumentalize the US intelligence and broader national security community the way Reagan did, but rather alienated it. From his rejection of the intelligence assessments of Russian election meddling to his marginalization of the State Department and his failed attempt to enlist the active duty military and the domestic repression of protest under the guise of law enforcement. And I would say that the country is more divided now than it was even in the 60s and 70s, mainly because of the extremity of the Republican Party and the fact that this has prompted, I wouldn't say an equal reaction, but at least an opposite one among Democrats. So you've got extreme polarity.
Yeah.
Even so, I think on January 5th, with Biden having defeated Trump, the system seemed to have worked to roll back these threats to sound American institutions. But then January 6th came and counseled against any kind of complacency that's going to stick. At this moment, I guess I would provisionally agree with Justin Vogt's position, set forth in what I thought was a very incisive and thoughtful review of the book in the Times. That intelligence officers.
Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
We should just mention, I was going to say that there is a very interesting, good review of the book that will be appearing in this Sunday's Times book review.
Right. It was online a bit earlier.
It's online. It's been online already.
Yeah. You know, he basically took the view, quite defensible, that intelligence officers with serious complaints are more likely to follow the lead of an Alexander Vindman or the anonymous CIA whistleblower who identified Trump's Ukraine manipulations, and in doing it that way, stay inside the designated lanes for lodging grievances for whistleblowers, rather than going to the lengths Philip Agee did. I think that may well be true, as long as there's some balance and some respectability restored to government, as Biden seems to be doing right now. But suppose Trump had actually engineered a coup and remained in office, the implied premise of which would be that he'd somehow captured at least part of the US national security establishment, including the intelligence community and the military, and renewed his assault on valued American traditions and institutions, including the parts of the national security establishment that weren't playing along. In that case, more extreme disenchantment and more dramatic course of action well outside the lanes, but also on the pretext of patriotism, would be far easier to imagine. And therefore, more case officers like Agee acting, at least presumptively, according to conscience.
Well, one sort of interesting piece of all that about Trump is that he made the CIA look good again. I mean, the deep state, those people became heroes, the people who were telling the truth. So
he did. And I think, and even as he, insulted the CIA publicly and the rest of the intelligence community and tried to marginalize it through, targeted appointments, particularly to the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. But for the most part, I think the agency held its nerve and, did its job to the extent that it was allowed to.
Yeah. So we have a couple of questions.
I think that too underlies Justin's point about people staying in their lane. Sorry.
People what?
Done. I'm done.
Okay. No, it's okay.
People staying in their lane.
Staying in their
people
lane.
Staying in their lane.
Yeah. So one question is that you mentioned that Agee's book was a literary cause célèbre when it came out in the 70s. Do you think his story had an effect on pop culture that extends past that time period? What was its lasting effect on national security? Those are big. The second one certainly is a big question.
Yeah, I think those are big questions. The impact, I think, on national security was not, perhaps huge. I mean, certainly it had an internal impact on the CIA. It made its doubt. It made it think that the loyalty of second generation CIA officers was more brittle than it had thought initially. The assumption, I think there'd been an institutional assumption that everybody was going to be like the first generation after the Cold War began, and be implacable Cold Warriors for whom loyalty was simply a condition of life, an existential reality. But Agee and others showed that this was not true. That there are various things that would wheedle their way into the psychology of a person who would appear to be a pretty good case officer, maybe mess things up for the agency. I think he has had a cultural impact in a number of ways. Certainly, the disaffected CIA officer has become a trope. If you look at movies, one movie appeared, I think, the same year as Inside the Company came out, 3 Days of the Condor. Now a not terribly good remake has been done on Epix. But that's still an influential movie, as evidenced by the fact that it's been revived. And I think another movie is Hopscotch, Walter Matthau, in which the main character has a Lauren, and Lauren has discussed this with me, has a conspicuously similar background to Agee. He's disaffected with the agency. The agency tries to pursue him. It's frustrated. As things shake out, the behavior diverges from Agee's. But certainly in the early stages of the movie, it almost appears to be directly inspired. Although I've never heard, I never read anything that says that it was.
Right.
But I think it came out in the early 80s, maybe. Lauren could probably confirm that. But so Agee would have been part of the culture by now.
Right. And he's a character in the novel that won the Booker a couple of years ago, 2 or 3 years ago. James,
That's right.
which is fascinating.
That's
James,
right.
um,
It is. Yeah. Brief history of seven killings. Brief
Yeah.
history of seven killings.
Yeah.
And actually, I was first alerted to that by another Coleman Center fellow,
By another
Sadia
one.
Hartman.
Oh, right.
By another Coleman Center fellow, Sadia Hartman. I didn't know about it before that. And of course, I went and read the book, and it's quite something.
Yeah.
And Agee is portrayed in a sort of a knowing way. Clearly, the author did his work, with a kind of swagger, and as somebody who knew exactly what he was doing, but was, I think, the way he's depicted there, he's really looking to strip the agency bare, and to illuminate the rest of the world about just how club-footed and dumb it is.
Yeah.
Which I don't think so. I don't think that's perhaps exactly in line, but allowing for literary license.
Yeah.
It's a great depiction. The hard facts there are pretty much all right.
It's Marlon James. I got the name wrong, but you got it right, right?
Marlon James, yeah.
Yeah.
Brief History of Seven Killers won the Man Booker.
Yeah. Another question, isn't the left-right skepticism about US involvement in foreign wars something positive?
Yeah, I hear in that question a very well-informed recognition that the one thing the left and the right can agree upon now is that we shouldn't overextend ourselves in expeditionary foreign wars. For example, I think Biden's withdrawal from Afghanistan was overdetermined. Any president would have done it, Trump or Biden. It was just going to happen.
Yeah.
And yes, I do think it's good that there is now a strong voice for restraint, and that's now, I think, embedded in the mainstream with institutions like the Quincy Institute, writers like Andrew Bacevich, Barry Posen, Stephen Walt, Mearsheimer, all of those people who used to be sort of labeled rock rib realists are now, I think, given a lot more rhythm, and properly so. So yes, I think that's a good thing. And whether that's in substance, you could read that fairly broadly as vindication of Agee's position, that the U.S. Stuck its nose too far into people's business, and not just on the military level.
Yeah.
Also on the level of local politics, often by coercive means.
Here's another one. What have been the reactions? What have the reactions been like to this book? Is this viewed as a story of the past, or is this ruffling some current feathers?
Well, I think there are I think three basic possibilities in terms of how people react to it. One is sort of the liberal establishment one, which is nicely represented by Justin Volton in his review. Which is, Stevenson's being a little charitable here. Agee overreached. He was, in fact, kind of self-regarding, even if he might have had a few good points. One of the metaphors that Justin uses slightly differently than I am here is that a stopped clock is right twice a day. So I think that was a predictable and understandable response, one that I expected, that I may be going a bit too far in painting Agee as a noble traitor. And I would add that I do think he went too far. I wouldn't have done it. Nevertheless, complex motivations make for an interesting person.
Yes.
The other reaction is one, is one from the right, farther right, which would be, what the hell is this idiot, meaning me, doing, even half glorifying this miscreant who was a flagrant traitor who probably should have been taken out? That's the right extreme. And the left-hand one is, You know, Agee was essentially a disaffected idealist who, and it's sort of like, I sort of hinted this in the mock interior monologue that I set forth a few minutes ago. You know, a disaffected idealist who lamented the path that his country had taken on the altar of the Cold War, and you know, was seeking to try to free the world of the impositions that it had visited, that the United States had visited, and therefore should be regarded as a dissident hero. So I think there are three possibilities. And then I guess the fourth is, you know, he got it just right. I don't know if I'm going to get many of those, although the Kirkus Review did give me credit for being very even-handed. So I'm happy with that.
Mm-hmm. Good. In 2017, Senator Schumer said the following to Rachel Maddow: "If Trump goes against the intel community, they have 6 ways to Sunday of getting back at you. How is this not a threat to democracy? A senator openly stating on TV that an unelected, unaccountable agency can conspire and or seek revenge against a president. Incredible yet disturbing statement. Thoughts?"
Well, the agency for 4 years faced a president that was openly hostile to a lot of its most important assessments about the integrity of American democracy and even of the American state, and the threat that it faced from an arch strategic rival, Russia, which had revanchist intentions. And, you know, the agency didn't really step out of its lane and try to do anything that, you know, the people who believed that it was part of a deep state that had serious extra legal capabilities that it would bring to bear might have expected it to do. You know, it pretty much played the game, and you know, somewhat, I mean, broadly in line with the way the military behaved. You know, tried to keep business going as usual and weather the political storm. And it seems to me that so you know, I suppose it's true that the CIA does have the capabilities to make an American citizen whose activities it doesn't like, to make that person's life miserable. It had those capabilities back when Agee was behaving as he did. For one reason or another, it didn't kill him. It didn't physically harm him. It did try to make life inconvenient for him. But, you know, again, there was some degree of constraint. And since then, it's been built into the agency institutionally. Now, obviously, there are extraordinary circumstances can prompt excesses, as we know from 9/11, the egregious torture program. But, you know, that did get fixed one way or the other. And, you know, I think when Obama left office, he left it in the hands of a director who did want to see the agency move back closer to the core mission of collecting and analyzing intelligence, and away from you know, regime change intrigues or you know, paramilitary activities.
Yeah, yeah.
Or, well, extraordinary renditions actually did stop in the Bush administration, but yes, that's another egregious example.
We have another couple of minutes. If you have time to say this quickly, it's to talk about Agee's father, who had started out politically on the right, sort of conservative. And I actually wanted to ask you about Agee's Catholic background, but we're not going to have time for that. But after Agee's actions in treason, the father eventually came around and was really quite proud of him. He kept his son's books on the coffee table. Was that family loyalty, or do you think he was actually persuaded? How do you read that?
I think, well, I don't think his father became an advocate of treason broadly construed, but I do think he was convinced by the case that AG made for his actions. I don't think there's any other way to read it.
Yeah.
I think that, a contributing factor might have been the way the agency behaved right after AG's turn and after the publication of the book. I think it instrumentalized the IRS to audit AG's father. It tried to use, I think it tried to send messages through AG's son to sort of increase the pressure. I don't think that these impressed AG's father very much, and I think it made him feel as though there may be some good reasons for Philip Agee turning against the agency. But I think in terms of the substance of why he did it, I suspect that has a lot to do with Agee's own persuasiveness and combined with the natural bias one has towards one's child to try to see him in the best light possible.
Thank you. Well, it's 8 o'clock. Thank you, Jonathan, for this conversation and for writing this fascinating book, which everyone can buy at the New York Public Library at the link that was provided at the beginning of the talk. And I think that really wraps it up for us. So thank you, Cullman Center and Library and Jonathan.
Thank you, Jean.
Thank you for joining us tonight. We are showing closing slides. This slide contains an image of the featured book. The cover shows a black and white cutout portrait of a young Philip Agee wearing glasses and a suit. The background is red with the title in large black letters, A Drop of Treason, Philip Agee and His Exposure of the CIA by Jonathan Stevenson. A Drop of Treason is available for purchase online from the library shop, on.nypl.org/shop-live. Proceeds benefit the New York Public Library. Reserve a copy for free with a New York Public Library card. Visit tonight's event page to find this title in a variety of formats, nypl.org/live. The last slide shows live from NYPL upcoming events. Tuesday, June 1st, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Amoral Men, Derek Delgadio with Neil Gaiman. Thursday, June 3rd, 8 p.m. Eastern Time. The Words That Made Us, Akil Reed Amar with Jeffrey Rosen. Tuesday, June 8th, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Spirit First, Akwaeke Amazi with Saidiya Hartman. For more information and to register, visit nypl.org/live.